Hello, and welcome to today's ESHA webinar on working with recipes in Genesis. My name is Brian, and I'll be joined by my colleague Alicia. This webinar is the second in a series of topics that cover Genesis R&D food essentials. We hope this will provide helpful instruction on the fundamental uses of Genesis and some general considerations that you may want to keep in mind when working with the software. This webinar will be recorded and available on the ESHA website, so it's easy to find and easy to share with any of your colleagues that may need to learn or review the basics of Genesis. Before we get into the main topic, let me give you a little bit of background on ESHA research. ESHA was established in 1981, and it's grown from offering one of the first nutrition and labeling softwares to a full suite of products and services, including Genesis R&D Foods, Genesis R&D Supplements, the food processor for dietary analysis, and our consulting services that provide labeling services, formula review, and expertise for customized projects. Genesis R&D Foods was first introduced in 1991 to help address the needs for convenient formula analysis and formatting of NLEA food labels for U.S. regulations. Over the years, Genesis has remained the go-to standard for food product development, recipe analysis, nutrition facts creation, as well as restaurant menu analysis and reporting. We offer label modules to prepare compliant labels for the U.S., Canada, the EU, and Mexico. Today, we will be demonstrating Genesis Foods version 11.9. If you have any questions about your license or your account, please contact the ESHA sales team at sales@esha.com. As I mentioned, this is the first in a series of webinars designed to cover some of the basic functions and present core understandings that you'll want to have about Genesis. Continuing the series in March, we'll be covering ingredient statements. And in April, we'll talk more about allergens. We routinely send out notifications on the upcoming topics. You can also find previously recorded webinars on the ESHA website in the Events tab. As always, this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording as well as a slide deck following the webinar. Please note that if you have any questions, send those in right away via the GoToWebinar control panel. Don't wait until the end. We have colleagues standing by to help respond to your questions. If we don't happen to get back to you during the webinar, we'll follow up with you directly. Today, we'll show you how to enter a new recipe into Genesis. We'll also take a look at setting serving sizes and discuss the rack. We'll take a look at the label. We'll also discuss best practices for organizing and documenting your recipes, and we'll end with a Q&A. Now I'll turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you so much, Brian. So one of the primary functions of Genesis R&D is recipe analysis. And I'll discuss some of the key points in entering and working with recipes in Genesis. And then we'll jump into the software to show you where to find those. Just a reminder that the webinar format provides an overview of ideas and features, but we also offer full hands-on Genesis R&D training sessions that cover much more detail and give you opportunity to work through your specific examples. We'll provide the training schedule towards the end of the webinar, and you can always find details on upcoming classes on the ESHA website. In working with Genesis, the basic steps are that you will build recipes from ingredients in the software. You'll set a serving size for the recipe so that Genesis calculates the nutrient content appropriately. And then you can view the analysis from the various reports available in Genesis, including nutrition facts label formats. With Genesis, the end goal might often be creating the nutrition facts label. You can build recipes from the ESHA database items that ship with Genesis, or you can add as many new ingredients as you need from your supplier information. The first webinar of this series covers adding new ingredients and more of the settings that apply to both ingredients and recipes, like units of measure, cost, notes, and more. Naming conventions and searching and recipes also piggybacks off of ideas presented in that first webinar. So if you missed the first webinar, you might want to check that out. We'll include a link for the ingredients webinar in the follow-up email that you'll receive later today or so. With recipe analysis in Genesis, you want to select ingredients that most accurately represent the foods you're working with. You also want to consider the steps and processes along the way and fine-tune your analyses as much as possible. Some processes like moisture loss from cooking or drying, storage conditions, ingredients added on preparation surfaces or production lines, frying oil, or any other ingredients used can potentially affect the finished product's content. You can enter any batch size that makes sense to you. Batch size entered might be in thousands of pounds, or some folks just enter the amount of ingredients that would make up one serving of the product. You could also enter your formula by percent if you know that information. To enter by percent, for example, you would use 100 grams to represent 100%. So you could enter your ingredients in grams corresponding to the percent of the formula. And then your total batch size should equal 100 grams or 100% when you've entered all of the ingredients. You can also work with the serving size in a few different ways. The serving size options are a recipe makes so many servings, or a recipe weighs a certain weight and unit like grams or ounces. In determining serving size, I do want to mention the RAC here, or the reference amounts customarily consumed. This is the section of the U.S. regulations used to determine serving sizes for labeling, and the RAC was updated with the 2016 labeling regulations. Canada and other countries also have similar reference tables regarding serving sizes or portions and their household units that are used to express serving size. You can see on this slide an example page from the RAC. For example, you would use this table to find the product category that your food best fits and refer to the reference amount listed in the table. For some foods, the reference amount is expressed in weight, and for some, it might be a volume amount. The reference amount is the standard FDA determined serving size. It's not a recommended amount of what consumers should eat, but it's rather the amount of each food type that Americans typically consume. And the RAC is used for consistency in labeling. So when we see certain food types, we want to have a somewhat consistent reference for the serving sizes. The label statement column in this table indicates the consumer-friendly household measures that are used when expressing the serving size on the label. And in general, we express both the household unit as well as a metric unit on the label. Sometimes your serving size might match the reference amount exactly. Sometimes your serving size may be larger or smaller, and this may depend on the unit size that you produce and how you've portioned your products or what kind of container sizes you use. So for example, with the bread here, loaf sizes and thickness of slices can vary from one type of bread to the next. For some breads, we might see one type of bread where one slice is 43 grams and another bread type where two slices is 56 grams. Both of those gram weights are close to the RAC of 50 grams. And then on the label, you would see the number of slices or pieces accompanied by the corresponding gram weight. For unsliced breads, there's an option or a reference amount of 2 ounces. So that gives the consumer context, and it might be accompanied by a certain inch size in inches, again, to give consumers an idea of how big a serving size should be. So in Genesis, you would set your serving size according to your typical processes, or you might formulate directly based on the gram weights that you see here in the RAC. But you want to keep the RAC in mind for declaring information appropriately on your label. And determining and declaring serving sizes is covered in great detail in our training classes, along with container labeling requirements like dual column labeling. I mentioned earlier that you want to consider all processes and ingredients that affect the content of the finished product. Genesis includes features and fields that allow you to apply adjustments to the analysis to best represent your foods. The Edit Yields feature includes a moisture adjustment, which is probably the most commonly used adjustment that we hear or receive questions on from customers. This can be applied to account for moisture loss in baking or reduction of sauces or other cooking methods, drying or evaporation steps. Genesis allows you to remove some of the moisture content from the recipe, I'll show you this in the software, and we do have a separate recorded webinar that covers this feature in much more detail. Another way to address adjustments in your formula is with the nutrient override fields in the Edit Recipe features. This might be used if you have lab data that you wish to report rather than the calculated database data, or say you know a certain % loss occurs to vitamins during processing. Genesis offers a space to record and report that information. When you enter ingredients into Genesis, you can use the nutrient calculator to calculate and populate additional nutrient fields and units. This is also true for the recipes. Once you've entered your recipe, you can use the nutrient calculator to see if any additional fields can be filled in. This can be helpful in converting units that were used in previous regulation to the new required units. For some nutrients like vitamin D, IU to micrograms, there is a straight conversion. And for other nutrients like vitamin A that you can see here and vitamin E, you might be prompted for source detail, like is it coming from a plant or a retinol source, or excuse me, a plant source or an animal or a retinol-like form of the vitamin. And that would cause you to choose the appropriate conversion formula, like you see here again with the vitamin A. You have some multiple choices and need to make some decisions with the calculator. I also want to mention a few nutrients specifically. Carbohydrates is expressed in terms of available carbohydrates for Mexico and EU labeling. In Genesis, available carbohydrates is determined by the total carbohydrates field, or it's labeled as carbohydrates. So the total carbohydrates field minus the total dietary fiber field. So for Mexico and EU, if available carbohydrates is not populated for your ingredients and for your recipe, then the calories and carbohydrates information on the label might not be reported correctly. You can use the nutrient calculator to populate available carbohydrates field for each ingredient, which is typically the best approach. Or for your recipes, you can manually enter available carbohydrates values. And you will see that there are a number of dietary fiber related fields in Genesis. Dietary fiber 2016 was included to accommodate the current US label. The FDA provided us with a specific definition for beneficial dietary fiber. So this dietary fiber 2016 field is intended for US 2016 label, and it is the field that shows up on the label. Whatever is populated in dietary fiber 2016 will pull forward to the US 2016 label. So you need to be sure that's populated when working with US labels. Outside of the US 2016 label, we have the total dietary fiber field. So the total dietary fiber field must be populated when you're working with labels outside of that US 2016 label. And as I mentioned, the total dietary fiber field is used to calculate available carbohydrates. So again, the carbohydrates and the total dietary fiber fields must be populated if you intend to use the nutrient calculator to determine the available carbohydrates. And then again, be aware of the intended uses of these fiber fields and use those correctly. After entering your recipes and perhaps using the nutrient calculator to populate additional nutrient fields, it's a good practice to use the Check Data tool. The Check Data feature includes a set of calculations being run to essentially review your work for you. The screen uses color coding to help identify some points that you may need to review and possibly even modify. Green typically means a go ahead, and red means that you may want to take a closer look at the numbers and just check that they make sense. Keep in mind that this check data screen does not indicate compliance or non-compliance necessarily. It is intended as a means of feedback, and there is a default tolerance set at 5%. You can adjust that as desired. The check data compares estimated or calculated values to your recipe totals. Data checks occur on calories, total fat, weight, or the proximates that make up the weight of the food, and carbohydrates. Values in green would fall within the tolerance, which means that they check out okay. And the values in red indicate that the math doesn't quite add up, and you may want to review the values reported to make sure that you have complete data entered for your ingredients. The calories estimated is based on 449 and 7 for alcohol. Calories entered is the sum of the calories reported for the ingredients in the recipe. So these two values are often different, or they could be different, and that's okay. You just want to see how close or how far off they might be and review the supporting data if you're getting, values that vary a great degree. The fat section compares an estimated fat value that is the sum of the fat components, compares that to the total fat reported for your recipe. If your ingredients don't report mono and polyunsaturated fats, these two numbers may not match. So total fat, saturated fat, and trans fat are required for most US labeling and for Canada. The unsaturated fats are typically voluntary nutrients. So unless a claim is made. So if you're not labeling the polyfats or the unsaturated fats, then it's okay for the section to not match. You just, again, want to remember what you're reporting. Is this just for mandatory labeling? Do you need to be declaring those additional fat components? And check your data, check the supporting data from the ingredients if those don't match, and you do need to be reporting more complete data. The weight section compares the sum of the proximates to the total weight for your recipe serving. And proximates, again, are the components that make up the weight of the food. And those are protein, carbs, fat, alcohol, water, and ash. You need to have all of those components reported for all ingredients in order for these numbers to match. And again, one note I want to make here is that if you plan to apply a moisture adjustment to your recipe, then you definitely need to populate the water field for the ingredients used in that recipe. In Genesis, it's called the water field, but on spec sheets or other information, you might see moisture as that data point. And you will hear me say this repeatedly. It is best practice to review the spreadsheet report for all of your recipes. When viewing the check data screen, if you see nutrients that need review, then use the spreadsheet to investigate. The spreadsheet lists each ingredient and its nutritional content, and it also indicates missing values with dashes and override values with red text. So if you see dashes, this tells you where you need to review ingredient records and fill in the blanks in order to report complete and accurate information. You can see in this example here that 2 of the ingredients are missing dietary fiber 2016 values, and we need this information for US labeling purposes. So at a minimum, you want to check to see that the mandatory label nutrients are populated for each ingredient. And in general, check to see that the values make sense. So if you saw added sugars was higher than total sugars, that would be an indicator that some data is off, and you want to look into those. In addition, as I mentioned, if you are making a moisture adjustment, you'll want to be sure that the water field is populated for your ingredients. And if you see dashes on your spreadsheet, you want to fill in the blanks. To fill in the blanks, you would open the ingredient record, populate the missing nutrient fields in the ingredient, and once you edit the ingredient record, this change carries forward to the recipes using that ingredient and onto the labels and other reports for those recipes. Genesis includes several predetermined nutrient sets found in the nutrients to view settings. These are the nutrients that you see on screen when you're working with ingredients and recipes, as well as on reports. The nutrients to view does not determine the nutrients on the label. Those are set in the edit label features. But when you click on the nutrients to view button, you see all of the nutrient sets available, as well as a check mark next to the set that you have selected. It might be when you first open Genesis, the default set may be the one that is checked, and that contains about 60 nutrients. You can select a different set at any time. Just click on any of the sets in the list. You'll be able to see label-related sets and a few others, and you can create new customized sets of nutrients to view. One example might be creating a set that includes the US 2016 label set of nutrients with the addition of the water field. So you could record and review that information. Or if you commonly work with fortified cereal products, perhaps, you might create a set that includes the label nutrients with the additional vitamins and minerals that you need to report, like the B vitamins included in your set. In Genesis, we use groups as the term to categorize records. ESHA software includes a list of groups, including characteristics, databases, and food types. You can assign ingredients and recipes to these groups to help filter searches. You can assign a recipe to multiple groups, and you can also create your own groups to help manage your records. Like with versions of your recipes as they make their way through stages of development. And we have a full webinar that discusses groups as a way to organize your files. Genesis offers a variety of reports. Some show totals for your recipe, while others, like the spreadsheet, also show individual ingredient detail. I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with the reports and choose those in the software that work best for your needs. So after you've entered your recipe, you want to store some form of your final version for record keeping. This is especially important with recipes used for labeling. Like I said, there's a variety of reports available, and you might find some that meet your preferences best. So in Genesis, you can save a record of a report as a PDF, and what that does is creates a snapshot in time. It will likely be dated. The date is typically included on the reports. Creating that PDF just creates that documentation that you might need. One thing that I might do is save a copy of the recipe, the spreadsheet, because that's giving me the details of each ingredient that I've used and their nutrient information at that point in time. And then I might use the label display and save all of those as a PDF and save that back to the recipe file. So I'll show you how to do that in Genesis. So now I'll move over to Genesis and we'll take a look at some of these features. We have a lot to cover, so just remember that this is being recorded if you need to review later. So when you open Genesis, you'll see the screen here. I'm working in version 11.9 today, and with the cloud version or cloud subscriptions, if your subscription is current, then you're kept up to date automatically. But if you have a desktop installation, you can check the version number that you're running by clicking the About button. And if you do have any questions about your account or your version number or license, please reach out to the ESHA sales team. So to add a new recipe from this home screen, we could go to File and then New Recipe, or just click on the New button and choose Recipe. So here I'll create a new recipe and I want to give it a meaningful name. I talked more about naming conventions in the ingredients webinar. So if you need to review that, that could be helpful. But for this purpose, I'll just give it a name. And the name does need to be unique. So again, consider the conventions that you're assigning with your recipe names. And if there are more than one of you at your organization that work with Genesis, you want to have a consistent method for naming these so you can all name consistently and find the recipes that you need. Then, as I mentioned, we have the serving size section. So you'll see you could indicate that a recipe makes so many servings. A serving weighs a certain weight, and the weights available here: grams, kilograms, ounce weight. We could choose from those. The default is set to gram. Or then a serving is, I'll show you that in a bit, it ties back to this measures function. So here I'm just going to enter a gram weight and indicate that a serving weighs this set gram weight. Down here we have some optional fields. So you could give the recipe a common name, which is usually a shorter or friendlier name, and that would appear on some of the reports as the title of the recipe. And then the user code, that would be a unique code. It might be an internal code that you would use to help track and search and filter your recipes. Again, these are optional, but if it's helpful to sort and search for your recipes, you might use these fields. And then you can also include a product and supplier name. So here, we have a populated list, and these are for the ingredients that are included in the software. But if you do create recipes that one of these names applies to, you could certainly use one of those. Or if you need to create a new supplier or brand name, you can certainly choose the new button and add any number of new names to this list. One way this could be helpful is if you could add your company's name as product or supplier and add those to any of your recipes. Or if you have certain customers, include their names, add their names to these lists, or certain project names. You could even add a project name to the product or supplier and use those fields to help track those recipes. So I'm going to click OK from here and just get started on building my recipe. We'll come back to those other tabs in just a bit. So again, I talked more about searching in the other webinar, but here you just type in the ingredient names that you might want to find from the ESHA database, or if you've already added ingredients from your suppliers. So I'm just going to search for an all-purpose flour, and I know which one I need. I did include USDA in the name because that is one of the flours I want to use, but just to show you the difference, if I didn't include USDA, the search results would appear a bit differently. You can see more search results. And again, the product and supplier columns are showing us where these sources of information come from. And again, I just wanted to mention ESHA, the ESHA code field here. This indicates, if you see an ESHA code, that indicates that the ingredient is part of the ESHA database. It ships with Genesis. If there's no ESHA code, then that's an indication of an ingredient that was added by you or someone at your organization. So it's just an easier way to keep track of which ingredients, or one way to keep track of which ingredients come from where. You can click on the headers here to sort these items as well. So I'll select this flour and I'll enter it in by weight. And again, here you can notice once we've selected it, the amount that we've entered, the ESHA code is showing, and we have product and supplier. So I can just continue entering the ingredients as I need to build my recipe. Here I search for distilled water. And you might notice here, we have units of measure, of course, the weight units, but here this liquid also has volume to weight equivalents for this ingredient. And so I could choose to enter this ingredient in gallons. And it would bring in the amount I want. Or if I needed all of my units to be consistent, I could certainly do that. So again, if I'm entering in by weight, just double click to open this item again, and I can change the amount of the weight that I'm entering here. And enter that in pounds. So really, again, however you have your formula indicated, and however it works best for you to search for your ingredients. I can also search by ESHA code, which I did here for this ingredient, or again by name or partial name, just depending on what items or what's easiest for me to work with. So here I have my recipe, and once I've built that, this one's fairly simple, I'm going to save it just out of good practice. It's confirming the name that I've assigned. And then let me talk a little bit more about this screen. So like I mentioned, we have obviously ingredient names and the quantity and measure that we've added, the ESHA code for those that would include that. I have a couple other fields here: total weight in grams, government code, the product supplier, and a nutrient. To change the columns that are displayed on this screen, just right click and you'll see a list of options. One is display columns. So I could choose to include more columns here, or I might choose to omit some of these. So check or uncheck from these primary columns. For nutrient information, if you want this displayed on the recipe screen, you can certainly include those. Otherwise, I'm going to remove calories. So I click the edit button in this nutrient columns section and just double click to send that back over and unselect it. Click OK, and then this screen is a little simplified, not as much information going on here. So now we'll go to the Edit Recipe screen. So in this Recipe tab, back to the Edit Recipe, and we'll talk a little bit more about these options. So the Nutrients tab is next. And I'm going to just list the nutrients that I have based on my Nutrients to View selection. So I have the US 2016 mandatory. And you can see the amounts per 43 grams are my serving size, the nutrient amounts. We have the value, a percent DB column, and then we have the override column. So I mentioned that if you needed to enter an override value, perhaps based on a lab analysis or known yield factors or adjustments that need to be made, and you need to adjust one of these specifically for your recipe, you can certainly do that. I'll enter an override for sodium. So notice here the percent DV, and here's the original value. Say I had lab results that were drastically different. I wanted to enter that in. So just enter a new value. I do click out of that field just to retain that change, and notice the percent DV has adjusted based on my override value. And then one way you can see more information here, like I mentioned, I have my selected set of nutrients based on my nutrients to view set. I could choose the show all nutrients button here, and this is showing me all the nutrients and components that are available in Genesis. It's quite a lengthy list, it's around or over 170 some, and then you can add new nutrients to your software. So that shows all of these. It can be listed per category. So we have the basic components first, followed by vitamins and minerals, or you can choose to alphabetize if you would like. And that just lists everything in alphabetical order, starting with the numbers. So a couple different ways to find nutrients if you're looking for something specifically. I did mention the available carbohydrates and the dietary fiber field. So I just wanted to show you those in this screen. So carbohydrates refers to total carbohydrates, and that's what we see on most US reported information, like the USDA database and a lot of spec sheets. If you're obtaining data on spec sheets from outside of the US, or certain sources may prefer to report available carbohydrates. So again, that would be factoring in total carbohydrates minus total dietary fiber to arrive at the available carbohydrates value. So again, if you're working with certain countries that use the available carbohydrates value to report carbohydrates on their label, then you want to make sure that that field is populated. And then again, with the dietary fibers, we have total dietary fiber field that's used in that available carbohydrates calculation. And then we also have the dietary fiber 2016 field that is used for the US 2016 labeling. So again, be aware of what labels you're creating or what reports you're providing, and be sure that you have the nutrients selected for the intentions that you need. In working with the nutrients and the recipes here, like I mentioned, we might choose to see if available or additional nutrients could be calculated. The nutrient calculator, or the calculate nutrients button here, you can click on that, and depending on how complete the data reported already is, you'll see a number of available nutrients that could be calculated based on the already populated data. So again, even though we already have available carbohydrates reported because we had that from ingredient data, we could choose to just run a calculation using the total carbohydrates value, the total dietary fiber value reported for the recipe, and then come up with a calculated available carbohydrates value. So if you want to calculate a nutrient, just select that from this list, and then the software tells you the formula that will be used. I mentioned the various vitamins. So vitamin D, again, we switched in the US, we switched from reporting in IU to micrograms. So you may still have spec sheets or information that report in IUs. You need to convert that to micrograms. That is a straight conversion. So you can choose I want to calculate vitamin D micrograms, and it will use the IU information reported and perform that calculation. And again, vitamin A as an example, if I wanted to calculate vitamin A RAE, micrograms of RAE for current US labeling or other countries that use RAE, then I could certainly do that if I know the source of the information. So for vitamin A, we have to know if it's an animal or a retinol form, or if it's a plant-based or a carotenoid type source of the vitamin A. It all has to come from one or the other in order to perform this calculation correctly. If it's a mixed source of vitamin A, then you may have to do some hand calculating. But at least the software does give you some choices for some of those conversions. And then again, if you've chosen to, you've entered your recipe and maybe chosen to populate some of these additional nutrient fields, then use the check data screen here to just review the information that is being reported for a few of these components as a double check. So again, we have the tolerance. You can enter a new value there as needed. We have this calories section. So again, the estimated is using 4497 based on what's reported for our recipe, calculating a calories value, and then comparing that to the calories value that is reported in the software. By default, Genesis takes the sum of the ingredients per serving to come up with this calories value. So you want to see how close or how far apart those are. We have the total fats section. So again, the total fat entered for this recipe per serving versus the sum of saturated, mono and polyunsaturated and trans fats. So these numbers are a bit different on mine. So again, if I'm not planning to report the unsaturated fats on my label, I may be okay with this. If I do need to provide more complete data, then I need to go back to each ingredient and perhaps update all of the fat information, make sure that it's being reported or correct, and make those changes as needed. And then here my weight components match exactly, and we have available carbs reported. So again, not necessarily a compliance report here, but it is a great way to review the work and just see if anything is terribly off or if the numbers make sense. So then moving down this list, we have the measures. I have a gram weight, but I might want to enter another unit. So I can choose edit measures and add a new unit. So for bread, I might choose 1 slice equals 43 grams to give this serving size some context and just kind of confirm my household measure. So once I do that, you'll see it adds, I have 1 serving, 43 grams, and I have a slice now at 43 grams. There are volume measures, depending on your product. You know, there's a list of units available here. So whatever is appropriate for your product. There is a Brix calculator. So here it's defined as Brix as the sugar content of a solution. If that fits with the products that you're working with, you could use the Brix calculator. You can also track cost for recipes in Genesis. So here, best practice would be to populate each ingredient cost field, and then as you assemble your recipe, the cost information is brought forward to your recipe and you'll see a total. You can include a cost per amount. And with the cost, there's no dollar sign or currency indicator. It just assumes whatever is your common currency that you're working in. And then you can select cost or enter a cost per however many units and whatever that may be. You'll see here in my measures, I added slices of units, so now that's available in the cost options as well. We have groups in Genesis, and so I mentioned those briefly, but here you can see the different sections. We have characteristics available that are, again, dairy-free, gluten-free. For here, the bread, I might choose whatever is appropriate. Gluten-free definitely would not be appropriate. Perhaps I have my kosher certification and a vegetarian indicator here, and then knowing that it's a bread and bakery in this food groups section of the groups here, I could choose bread and bakery. But again, you can choose multiple groups for any recipe. You can also add to the group. So here I've added some production, a production folder, and then some steps in the processes. So it may be that at the very beginning, I want to mark a certain group as an indicator that it's in this process, but then as this recipe moves through the stages of approval, then I could certainly have folders to help track that information. We have attributes. These are a way to track certain traits for your recipes. Genesis includes the bioengineered attribute. I've added a few others here, as you can see. You can add your own attributes. And to do so, you just click on this Add an Attribute button. So you'll need to name it, give the attribute a name, and then you'll need to choose a rule that applies to this attribute. So you can see here I have my no artificial color attribute. So for something like a no artificial color, in order for my recipe to qualify for no artificial color, all items in my recipe must have the no artificial color attribute. So I would select this first rule. On the other hand, with something like bioengineered, if at least one item is marked, one ingredient is marked with the bioengineered attribute, then that could carry forward to the recipe. It would carry forward automatically if I have an ingredient. But say if there is a regulation that exempts a certain attribute, you can override. So here the qualifies is showing what is known. So question marks mean it's unknown. Green check mark would mean that yes, it qualifies for bioengineered. The red slash circle says no, this is not a bioengineered food. But if you were getting an indicator based on your ingredient status, as perhaps, yes, it is bioengineered, but there was an exemption for your food, you can override that indicator here. And then, of course, you would want to include documentation that states why or why not that attribute applies. We have the compare to, which is typically, I believe it's by default set at the US adult label. You can certainly change that. And what this does is when you're looking at certain reports, the comparison profile is chosen from here. So mine is set to US label 2016. If you have an older version and have never switched this, it might be set to the 1990 label. Working in Canada, you may want to set that to the Canadian adult label. Or if you work with specific population groups, you can certainly choose from the DRI list. This does not set the label settings. It is on other reports. We have a preparation method section that allows you to include more preparation information, say to pass on to your kitchen. The reference amount area here refers to the nutrient content claims. So the reference amount, or like I showed you with the rack, for US labeling, the rack is used to determine if nutrient content claims are appropriate for a recipe. So as I mentioned, you might set a serving size that matches the rack exactly, or if it doesn't, you may want to enter a reference amount here so that when you are working with nutrient content claims in the software, then you have the specific rack as your reference, and then the nutrient content claims are based on the rack serving size that you would enter here. And then for this nutrient content claims tab, for comparative claims like less than or low in, you need to select a reference recipe. And that represents the typical content for the same type of food as your recipe. So here you would choose select and then search through the recipes that you already have. If you don't already have a standard reference recipe, then you might need to create one and just use that as the reference recipe here. We have notes fields. So here there are 3 notes fields, and these can be used for any purposes. It's just a big text field for you to type in and document anything that you need. One thing to mention here is you can change the titles. So if you click on the notes title, this takes you to the My Preferences section here. And then here in the notes, you could change these. As I mentioned in the ingredient webinar, perhaps you want to use one notes field as an internal note section and another as an external. So you can just change those, click OK, and now you can see the changes to the titles to help you keep track of the uses. Again, one thing you want to keep in mind, the My Preferences is set to each user. So if you have multiple Genesis users in your organization, be sure that you all set Notes 1 field to the same, like the internal, Notes 2 to the external, so you're not sending information out of your organization that you wouldn't want to share. We have Hassip Guidelines, and here the edit button will show you there is a hot and a cold section of hazard and control points indicators that you can include with your recipe. So you would find the food group or food type, and then you can see the handling, cooking, storage, those type of instructions that you might want to include on any reports that you generate from Genesis. And then here we have with attachments, the capability to add attachments directly to the recipe. So you can just drag or drop files or click and browse your files to include any documentation that you might want to include along with your recipe. So that covers the tabs here. I do want to show you a few other features and the reports that you want to keep in mind or just that are available here in Genesis. So I am going to show you the spreadsheet report here. And again with this, let me do one more thing. We're going to add one more ingredient just to make it fun. So I'm going to add a butter for this butter top bread, but I did want to show you as well. This is an ingredient that I've added. So you'll note that it's showing up in a slightly different color, darker green in this case, than the ingredients that ship with the software, and no ESHA code. So again, just a way to know that that is an ingredient that I added to the software. And so then I view the spreadsheet report, and here I can see this butter that I added is missing some nutrients. So again, indicated here by dashes. And I want to make sure that I report these because saturated fat, dietary fibers 2016, and added sugar are all those that I would need to include on my label. So I want to make sure that those are reported in my recipe. So to add that information, if I go to this ingredient, like I said, you want to update the ingredient record, and then that will pull forward to the recipe. I can right click on this ingredient within my recipe and open item to open this ingredient record. So this is opening just the butter ingredient record. And then here I want to I'm going to not show all of my nutrients and just work with those that are required on my label. And I want to fill in the saturated fat information. The dietary fiber 2016, because I'm working with a US label. And then the added sugars. So if I didn't have this information, I would want to contact my supplier and make sure these values, get know what these values are and plug those in. For some, it might be that the ingredient information that I have, I might be able to determine, like the dietary fiber, the added sugars. Here I have an ingredient statement, so I know that my sugars are all occurring from the sweet cream. There's no added sugar in this ingredient, and there's no dietary fiber being reported. So those values I might be able to determine based on the ingredient itself. But I'll save this ingredient record and then update it. It updates for my recipe. So now we have the saturated fat, dietary fiber, and the added sugars values here. I do want to show you the nutrients to view. I mentioned that. And when you click on the Home tab and the Nutrients to View button, again, you'll see the list. Down here is what you will likely see until you've added some of your own. So we have some basic sections, a little more specific for some, and then all of the label related nutrient sets of nutrients to view. So I have my US 2016 mandatory set selected. You'll see by the check mark. I could choose to report all, which would be the mandatory and the voluntary nutrients for the US label, or I could create my own. So if I click on Nutrients to View and Modify, I'm going to see whatever set I have selected. So I have the US 2016 All set, shows me what nutrients those include, choose Edit, and you'll see this screen. So we have available nutrients, all the others that are available in Genesis, as well as those that I already have selected. So to select new nutrients and create your own set, you can double click here, or just let's find total dietary fiber and bring that over. So I have that reference. So use the arrows or double click. And then here you can rearrange the nutrients here by clicking and dragging or using these up and down arrows. So once you assemble the set that you want to create, choose OK and then save as, then give it a meaningful name, something that tells you what's in that set so you can remember. I'm not going to save this because I already have a lot of sets saved. But when you go back to this Nutrients to View screen, you'll notice that any sets that you've created occur here at the top of the list and then followed by those that ship with Genesis. So that's the Nutrients to View. And again, that shows you the nutrients that will be reported on reports. So you can see here, I switched mine to the all 2016 US nutrients, and my spreadsheet has many more nutrients reported on it. It doesn't indicate the nutrients reported on labels. Those are within the edit label settings. Back to the reports, just briefly, I want to show you a few, but again, take a look at the reports in the software and just see which of those might work best for you. This is the multi-column report. We commonly see this. It shows a per serving column. It can show per 100 grams, as well as the recommendations for that label profile and what percent you're seeing. So here you can check these boxes up here to choose less or more columns for this report, the multi-column. The single nutrient report we might use. This ranks the ingredients by the amount that they're contributing to whichever nutrient is selected. So here I have carbohydrates, so it's listing in order how much each ingredient contributes to the total carbohydrates. Just click up here to choose a different nutrient and see how those contribute. And then this set of nutrients here is driven by the nutrients to view. So whichever set of nutrients to view you have selected, this may provide more or less nutrients to select from for the single nutrient or single nutrient report. And some of the reports here, you'll see this blue booklet style. I'll show you the label display. They just have a slightly different format, maybe a cleaner look. It does default with the ESHA logo, so you can see that at the top. Oops, sorry. And then this one has the label, ingredients, and allergen statements. And lastly, we have the spec sheet. 100 gram spec sheet was added relatively recently, and it just provides you with a form that you could use to report as a 100 gram spec sheet. This was a request. You can add date information. So there are a few fields that you can fill in directly from this screen, and then other information by default is pulling in 100-gram amounts, lists your serving size, and then shows the nutrients based on the nutrients to view set that you have selected, as well as ingredient and allergen information. You can also include more comments and add a signature line. And then in doing so, when you can also add a logo, your logo for these reports, and then in doing so you have this cleaner report that you could send as a PDF, print a PDF here, and share with others. So it was really designed to serve as a 100-gram report, but you can edit that to a different amount. Notice the nutrient amounts here will change based on the amount entered here. So again, just look through the reports and find which work best for you. Going back to the recipe tab here, another I do want to show you is the view label screen. And I often work with this as I'm building my recipe, then I might take a look at my label and just see how it is looking and what information is already plugged in. This is a pretty complete label, but it's not compliant by any means because it is missing a bit of the required information. And then I'd need to do some work on my ingredient statement and the allergens. But here quickly I'll show you 2 steps. You go to edit label. This opens up the features that you would use to make the selections to format this label. So there's the regulation based on the module that you have. If you have multiple modules for your Genesis, you may or may not see more of these available on the list. And then certain styles, but then very basics, the serving size, I might say include the household measure as 1 slice. And then perhaps include a servings per container amount. Maybe we'll just do that. Click OK, and then it updates the label so that this may or may not be a compliant label. I still want to do some reviews, but at least it's getting more of that basic information filled in. Because this is a bread, and I mentioned the moisture adjustment, so I will show you that edit yields would be the way to apply a moisture adjustment to this recipe. And this could be determined in a few ways. I have my original value moisture content here, and I might know that perhaps this is a 100-pound batch, and when I finish that it's around 80 pounds. So I have 20 pounds of moisture loss. So I could enter the weight loss here in this moisture adjustment. I'll go ahead and do that and notice what it will do to the label values. So by removing moisture, it can affect the nutrient values that you see on that label. Based on this set serving size that I indicated, it's pulling water out of each serving or moisture content out of each serving. And so that can certainly typically increase the nutrient values that I see on the label. And then again, you could enter a percent. And we have a webinar that covers this in much more detail, but I do want to make note that the percent moisture adjustment or loss that you might apply is not the percent of the total weight of the recipe, but it refers to the amount of this original water value or moisture content. So what percent was lost in terms of the moisture content. If it's a 20-pound loss of this around 100-pound batch, that wouldn't be 20% of the moisture loss. That would be more around, I think it's like 36% or so. So my moisture percent loss would be 36%. So just be mindful of what language Genesis is speaking when you're applying a percent moisture loss. A couple more things that I want to cover. So thanks for sticking with us. From the Home tab, I did mention the My Preferences when I changed those titles for the notes. But again, just to let you know that My Preferences is your user preferences. There are a lot of different settings and display options that you could choose. So I showed the title headings there. There are also decimal places that you might want to choose. The regulation that you have set for the default So mine is set to 2016 NLEA labels. But again, if you're working with Canadian labels primarily or other countries, you might choose this regulation set to whatever is most common to you. So again, that's found in the My Preferences location. And one question we do receive that I wanted to cover here is where you search and replace. So with your recipes, as you continue to assemble these, your list of recipes that you can open, your open recipe will grow. So this could grow to, hundreds, thousands, however many you're managing. So if I want to show me all the recipes that contain this ingredient, I could go to Open Recipes and use the advanced search here. Whatever type in the name field is what will show up, but I also want to choose the search within items for matches to the above. So it's saying search within my recipes to this match. So I'm going to do municipal water. And this is showing me of my recipes, 29 of these use the ingredient municipal water. So that's a bit of information. I might want to print this list or export this list to record these recipes that do use that ingredient. And then if I wanted to perform a search and replace from this main screen here in Genesis, go to database, and there is a search and replace button. So again, if I was working with these water in recipes that contain the municipal water, search for municipal water and choose the one that I know I've used. And then perhaps I want to replace that with the distilled water ingredient that I have. So again, I'm searching for the distilled water that I want to replace with. And it's this one. So it's saying search for all the recipes that contain this municipal water, and I want to replace those with my distilled water. If I click OK, then it's confirming. Remember, you had 29 recipes with municipal water. Now it's going to replace these with the distilled. Just note here, there's no undo button. So once I've made this replacement for my 29 recipes, I may have more than 29 recipes that now contain the distilled water. And that's where I did the where used search and maybe print or export that list of the recipes using the original ingredient. So I have record if for some reason I needed to go back, because there's no undo here. So let me jump back to the slides, and I want to mention one more thing in Genesis, the Audit Trail feature. That can be enabled so that when a record is saved, a date stamp is added with user information that is logged, and you can see a comment field where you can enter notes on specific changes made on any other information that you want to track as part of your record keeping. The recipe features includes notes fields that you can use to manually record, but the Audit Trail automates this process and then again gives you that comment field. So whichever works well with your workflow, you might want to consider the Audit Trail feature. By default, the Audit Trail feature is turned off, as mine is. To enable the Audit Trail, if you have the desktop installation version of Genesis, get in touch with your account administrator. If you have a cloud subscription, then contact ESHA Tech Support, and they can help you out with that. So at this point, let me send it back to Brian for a bit more information.
If you feel that you could use in-depth instruction on more of the software features and compliant topics, we do offer Genesis training throughout the year. At this time, all of our courses are web-based. The most immediate trainings are listed here, and many follow our traditional format where you can attend the 2-day professional level class as well as a 3rd day of advanced training. If you already have a good handle on the basic Genesis features, you can choose just to attend the advanced training. Note that in April, we have a specific 2-day training that covers Genesis features, as well as a focus on labeling of USDA regulated foods. You can see the full training schedule on the ESHA website. If you have several Genesis users at your organization and need to arrange for group instructions, please reach out to our training team directly. You can contact them at training@esha.com. We're here to help, and you can stay in touch with ESHA in a variety of ways. If you have any questions about your account, your software license, additional modules or utilities, please reach out to your sales team. If you have a question about a specific feature or run into any issues, contact support. We invite you to join in the ESHA LinkedIn community, and you can find additional resources and subscribe to our blog and newsletter on the ESHA website. Now we're going to address a few questions that have come in. The first question is, when I calculate the calories for my recipe using 449, I don't get the same calories as Genesis. Why is that?
Yes, that's one of our most common questions that we receive. And as I mentioned, by default, Genesis reports calories as the sum of the ingredients and as the calories per serving. So any of your ingredients might have already adjusted for acceptable alternate factors. And then with US labeling, the FDA allows for additional factors other than 449. So we might have Atwater factors, which are more specific to certain ingredient types. We also might make adjustments or see adjustments for dietary fiber in a certain form from the carbohydrates. And then there are other known factors. We're seeing specific factors for sugar, alcohols, things like allulose that have different acceptable and acknowledged factors. So Genesis is just taking the total of each ingredient, summing that for the calories that you see. If you hand calculate by 449, then you might see different values, and that's okay. With the label features, there is a way to set the calories calculation method used. So you could use 449, or for Canada, 4492 is how it's listed, to apply that on your label. Just note that on the other reports, you'll see that directly calculated, or the sum approach for the calories that you see. Thanks.
Okay, next question is, how do I delete a recipe?
Sure, let me show you that. Let me jump back into Genesis. We always say, if you're going to delete, very carefully. So I was already in the database tab from this main screen in Genesis, and you'll see a delete option. So when you choose this delete button, you can choose recipe or ingredient or any of the label types. So you would just choose recipe, and it will pull up your list of recipes. From there, highlight the recipe that you want to delete, and away it will go. Another option that you might consider is archiving. So using the groups, you could set up an archive folder if you don't want to delete items, but rather kind of send them off into an archive state.
Okay, how do I know what moisture adjustments to make with my recipe?
And that there could be a couple different ways to determine that. And depending on what type of food it is, if you can assume that all of the loss between, say, a pre-bake and a post-bake weight, like with the bread example, if all of the weight lost is due to moisture loss, then you could use those differences in weights, like I talked about, to determine the moisture loss to apply. So it can either entering a moisture loss by weight, in ounces or pounds or whatever weight, or by entering a percent. But again, you need to determine the percent based on the moisture content percent. So that's one approach. The other might be, if you have a lab analysis, send product out to the lab and you get a moisture content, you could either set a target amount. In Genesis, target is one of the options for the yield adjustment, or again, you could calculate or determine the loss that needs to be applied. If it's not just moisture loss that is affecting the before and after weights of a cooked item, then you may have more to consider, and you might want to consider lab analysis for the data points that you need for the greatest accuracy.
Okay, and finally, I think this is going to be the last one we get to today. Do updates change my label?
They certainly can. So when we update the Genesis software, we do update some of the ingredients. Not every ingredient is updated at every software version update, but if you're using an ESHA database item that ships with Genesis and it is updated in a certain version cycle, then that could affect your recipes and your labels. as well as if you're using ingredients that you've added to your software, if you got an updated spec from a supplier and changed the ingredient record, that again pulls forward to your recipes and then can affect your labels. So that's where I mentioned taking a snapshot, like saving a PDF of the recipe and the spreadsheet and the label on your final version of your recipe is good practice. So you have that snapshot in time, and then if an update is installed or you update an ingredient record, you have that original documentation.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Just to note, if you do have questions in that have gone unanswered, we will be getting back to you through email. Again, there will be an emailed copy of this with the slide deck sent to you. It'll also be available on the website as well. Thank you. And if you have any questions, again, sales at ESHA for sales questions, training at ESHA for training, and then support at ESHA for customer support. Thanks a lot.